boy.
Canada.
Canada.
Well, doesn't it derive from a Ganyagawa word?
Means village.
As Indigenous people, we are used to our stories getting a little twisted. So listen up as we set the record straight. I'm Ganyahtiyo. Please join me as we hear from dozens of Indigenous people. Together, we will decolonize our words and our minds on the Telling Our Twisted Histories podcast. You can find episodes on the CBC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is a CBC podcast.
Can I get a double, please? Medium?
Also, can I have a chocolate chip muffin?
Ooh, chocolate chip.
Last week, I went on a road trip with Unreserved producer Kim Kasher. A very special road trip. Besides the fact I hadn't been out of my house for over a year because of COVID, today I was going to have a very special conversation with one of my favorite people in the world.
I'm kind of nervous. It's been a while since I've interviewed anybody, you know? This is Justice Murray Sinclair. It's kind of a big deal. He's kind of a big deal. I've heard.
The one and only Murray Sinclair. I've long been a fan of Justice Sinclair ever since I was a young Deerchild and first heard him speak about Indigenous experience in this place we call Canada, with passion and honesty. And this was no pandemic Zoom interview on a computer monitor. We were going to his house. If someone back when I was a young Deerchild told me I would be driving up to Murray Sinclair's driveway to have a chat, I would have laughed. Ha ha, I would have said. But here we are.
Come on in.
Hi,
Hey,
how are you? I'm good.
Good?
Should I take my shoes off?
Nope.
Okay.
You want to sit in here or you want to sit up there for now? Well, we got a TV, we got other places.
got a
we can
TV?
do. Right there, amongst the poles.
Oh, wow. Ever cool.
We can sit outside here for now.
Sure, okay.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Wow, this is so lovely.
His house sits along a dirt road just outside of Winnipeg. A big green field stretches out around it, fringed by trees and bushes. The sound of crickets and geese replaces the chaotic traffic, and the air is like a sweet song. These are the kinds of moments that make me really love my job. Danse, Anine, Boujou, hello and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. In just a few days, on Thursday, September 30th, this country will mark the first ever National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. It's a brand new federal holiday to commemorate Canada's Indian residential schools. We'll also remember those who survived the schools, our parents, grandparents, aunties, and uncles, and honor those children who didn't come home. Who better to talk on this special day than the Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair? He led the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for 6 years, hearing testimony all across Canada from our survivors, and helped form the 94 Calls to Action, the roadmap to reconciliation. Before that, he was the first Indigenous judge in Manitoba and only the second in Canada. He also led the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry back in 1988. And that's just the Reader's Digest version of his resume. Today we'll talk about where we are on the road to reconciliation and how long the journey will take. Plus, you'll find out what songs lift his spirits and pump him up. Let's just say we were very impressed. This is a special edition of Unreserved with the Honorable Justice Mr. Murray Sinclair.
Your title is super long now. Is it like Honorable Mr. Justice Murray Sinclair? Did I miss anything?
Well, yeah, you can go by that if you want. I just tell people, call me Murray. The justice thing is an honorific that some judges maintain, and I'm still referred to as senator. But again, that's not something you can claim, but if others want to use it, then I let them.
Titles. All the titles.
Yeah, all the titles. It's their titles, not mine.
Well, the last time we spoke, you were still in the Senate. Of course, now you're retired.
Yeah.
How is that working out for you?
Retirement, worst decision I ever made. I am working harder now than I did before because people now believe I have time for everything, as opposed to I'm so committed to the Senate that I don't have time for them. So I'm working at a law firm. I'm working with young Indigenous lawyers primarily who are just developing their careers, and they have lots of questions about the kinds of things they run into that challenge them psychologically, from a cultural perspective. And I like mentoring, and I do a lot of speaking engagements, and then a lot of work on my memoir.
Are you doing any traditional retirement things? Golfing, gardening, taking up the ukulele maybe?
No. The one hobby that I had for years, and still have it, is wood carving.
That sounds lovely. I somehow can't picture you whittling on the porch, however.
Well, whenever I'm out here, the problem with working with wood out here is, of course, it creates a mess that I then have to clean up. But more importantly, we have 3 dogs, and they're constantly wanting my attention. So you got to play fetch all day.
All day long.
All day. Yeah.
Well, that's a good retirement hobby to have, playing fetch with the dogs.
Yeah. Although it doesn't really fit on a resume very well.
Just tack it on the bottom, it's fine.
Dog fetcher assistant.
Can add that to your many titles. Murray, what keeps you so inspired to keep doing these things, doing all this
There's
work?
so much change that's needed, and it needs to be done at so many levels. And that's probably the major factor that influences me to say yes to something, whether it's a speaking engagement, a CBC interview, or a newspaper interview, anything. It's about the opportunity it presents to me to change one mind. And that's really what I want to do.
Change one mind.
Change one mind. Yeah.
Is that the thought you walk into every room with? I'm here to change one mind.
I do. When we were writing the TRC report, one of the questions that the team was challenged with, and I posed it to them, was the writing team, was I said, you have to think about who's your audience. You know, who's your audience? And they immediately got into a big dialogue around, well, this should be somebody that can read at a grade 7 level or a grade 10 level, so we have to write it at that level and make sure that we can articulate it in a way that people can understand. And I said, you're all missing the point. The point is that we are writing a report so that we can arm the reasonable people out there. We need to be able to give to people out there who want to fight for the cause of reconciliation the tools, the knowledge, and the references that they need in order to be leaders for reconciliation in their particular circles. And that's why the theme of the writing team for the TRC report was, we're writing this to arm the reasonable.
Wow. Did you have a big sign in the office?
I told them they were all forbidden to make me a T-shirt.
They're like, darn, I wanted to make that T-shirt. Arm the reasonable. Now, Justice, you led the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from 2009 to 2015. And when it was over, one of the things you said was, reconciliation is not an Indigenous problem. It is a Canadian one. We have described for you a mountain. We have shown you the way to the top. We call upon you to do the climbing. Now, 6 years have passed. How far up that mountain are we?
Well, I think it's like a mountain, it has various sides. And I think that to the extent that people have been making efforts to go up that mountain, they've taken easy routes and picked easy paths. And so we see things that are being done that are relatively easy to be done. But the reality is that until we change the way that people perceive each other, but in particular the way that non-Indigenous people perceive Indigenous people, and respect their existence in its fullest possible form, I think we will have difficulty getting to the top. Because it is about understanding that reconciliation is a lot harder than getting to the truth. And the reason I say that is because, A, there will be a very concerted and organized effort to stop reconciliation from coming about. So to stop the equality of Indigenous people, to stop Indigenous people from having their rights instituted into law or into the Constitution or protected in a way that can't easily be changed by a governing party that comes to power. So that sense of privilege that exists out there is going to be very difficult to overcome until all Canadians actually recognize that as a problem. And to this point in time, they don't. They don't see it as enough of a problem to do anything about.
More specifically, the TRC released 94 calls to action. How has Canada done in answering those calls? How much have we checked off that list?
Well, many of the calls to action, of course, were aimed at governments. The first 25 or so were clearly calling for government action because there was some crisis areas that needed to be addressed. But when you look at the process by which even some of that legislation, the Indigenous Languages Bill, the Indigenous Child Welfare Bill, the bill that recognized the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the process and the resistance that was clearly on display to the enactment of those laws certainly speaks to the fact that no matter what the intention of the government is, that there are forces that are at work both within government and outside of government that slow that process down. And the other difficulty is that the government of Canada really has no plan on how to achieve reconciliation. Mm-hmm. And I've challenged the Prime Minister directly. I said, you don't have a plan. Because he would ask me from time to time, he would invite me to meetings, and he would say, so how are we doing? And I would say, we're failing because you don't have a plan. I said, the Minister of Indigenous Relations is spending all of her time trying to convince Indigenous people to go along with government policy, when in reality, all of her efforts should be to convince non-Indigenous people that they have to start smartening up. Mm-hmm. That's what a Minister of Indigenous Relations should be doing. Not telling Indigenous people what to do, but telling non-Indigenous people what to do. And I say the approach to reconciliation on the part of government is all messed up. But the one change that I've seen, it's largely been on the part of the educational faculties, the educational teams. Mm-hmm. There are still large masses of teachers who don't believe any of this. But there is a growing body of educators who recognize that they have a responsibility to ensure that their students are given a broader and better education about the history of this country. To this point in time, the public school system has been teaching white supremacy and will continue to teach white supremacy until we stop them. It has been teaching that the arrival of Europeans in this country was a good thing. And they were good, kind people. They had the best interests of the Canadian Indigenous population at heart. Mm-hmm. And that there's nothing that they did wrong. It was the Indigenous people who got in the way of nationhood, and therefore, if they suffered as a result of it, it's their own damn fault. Mm-hmm. And that belief has permeated the educational system for a long time. But educators themselves are starting to approach things differently about that. And I'm impressed with that, because I think that's where the real change is going to occur.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm Jeremy Ratt. I'm half Indigenous and half white. Pieces is an all-new CBC British Columbia original podcast. This is a story of being stuck between two worlds, and not really fitting in with either of them.
So because I don't have darker skin or long brown hair, that therefore I was not Indigenous.
You don't have to be a residential school survivor yourself to be traumatized by residential school.
Pieces. Listen to it now, wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. My very special guest today is the Honorable Mr. Justice Murray Sinclair, or Mur, as I like to call him.
That indeed is me.
Who do you think is responsible for reconciliation? Is it government? Is it settler Canadians? Is it Indigenous people?
Everybody. It's not a spectator sport. You can't sit back and wait for other people to do things.
Personally, I don't believe Indigenous people should be doing the reconciliation work because I don't feel like I have anything to reconcile.
Well, it's not for us to.
When you say everybody, what do you mean by that? Like, what is it me as an Indigenous person should be doing to bring on reconciliation?
Yeah. It's not for us to teach non-Indigenous people how to reconcile. It's not for us to teach them how to be better white people. It is for us to teach our own children how to be better people. And it's for us to accept that we have been victimized for so long that we have forgotten how to be who we were meant to be. But to that extent, the reconciliation is part of what we have to do, but it's for ourselves. Because ultimately, by doing that, we will be able to deal with the other side, and that being the non-Indigenous side, on a better basis. I've said that reconciliation is about mutual respect, but before we can get to mutual respect, Indigenous people have to be given the opportunity to develop self-respect. And right now, we have to develop our self-respect as part of the process of reconciliation. And non-Indigenous...
How do we do that? I mean, it's easy to say, okay, go off and heal, but...
No, it's very simple, really. In many respects, it's about learning who your elders are, learning how to recognize who your elders are and who your teachers among them are, and to embrace your culture and what it means to be Cree, what it means to be Anishinaabe, what it means to be Dene, and to make that part of your life in such a way that you realize that you're not just a brown Canadian, that you are, in fact, an Indigenous person who happens to be living within the boundaries of this country. I've often said, that Indigenous people, just like every other child in this world, needs to be able to answer 4 questions as they're growing up. The first one is, where do I come from? And so that involves things like, who are my ancestors? Who are my ancestors' heroes? Who are the people who influenced my people's development? Who are the people that made us who we are today, or who we could have been today, or who made us who we are when we were first contacted? So where do I come from is also a spiritual journey too, because it is a part of how did my people get created? What is the story of our creation? And everybody has a creation story, and nobody's creation story is better than anybody else's, but we have to learn what ours is. And that second question is, where am I going? Because that's an influence by that first question. If you know where you come from, then that'll help you understand where you're going. So where am I going is not just about what am I going to do tomorrow night, who am I going to marry, but it's also about what happens to me when I die. Where do I go? And what happens to my body? What happens to my spirit? And so it's understanding not only life in terms of a physical journey, but life in terms of a spiritual journey as well, because part of all Indigenous teachings are that you go back to the Creator. You go back to be with the Creator, and your spirit has a connection to that road. And the third question, of course, is, why am I here? What's my purpose? Why was I created as opposed to somebody else? Learning how to answer that question is an important part of who you are. And, you can kind of deal with it in simplistic terms and say, well, I was born to be a judge. I was born to be a lawyer, but it's not that easy. It's part of understanding what your name is, because according to our teaching, The naming ceremony is not about creating a name for you. The naming ceremony is about finding out the name that you already have. Because when you are created, the moment that you are conceived, the Creator sends a spirit to be with you so that your existence is completed. Your body, your mind, and your spirit then become one. And that spirit already has a name, and he already has a purpose. That's why the Creator put him there. And so that's what it is you're really asking that elder or that name finder to do for you, to find out what the name of that spirit is, but also what the purpose of that spirit is. And then that helps you figure out how you're going to do things. So my destination in life was not to be a lawyer. My destination in life, though, was to help people find answers to problems that we were all dealing with. So that's why my name is Mzenegijik. Mzenegijik literally means images in the sky. But the story behind the name, the story of the spirit behind the name is that it's the one who speaks of those pictures in the sky so that he can help the people. And so that's my name, and that's my purpose. So I am to help the people. I'm Mzenegijik. And then the fourth question, of course, then is, who am I? Who am I? That's the totality of it all. Who am I? And you never really, I don't think you ever really answer that question until you are just about to leave this creation, and then the Creator makes you turn around and look back at everything you've done. And then everything that you have done, all of the tracks that you've made, all of the people that you have influenced, that's who you are. And so that's the question that you only get to answer at that point in time. But in knowing that, then you know that it is important that you do the right thing while you are here. So that's why answering that question, or figuring out the answer to that question, is important. And our people need to learn about things like that, because each of our tribes, each of our groups of people have teachings very similar to that.
Thank you. You're listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Native Voice 1, and Sirius XM. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. My guest today is the Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair, retired senator and chair of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. September 30th this year marks the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. What was your reaction when you first heard about this new stat holiday, besides, okay, we'll get another day off?
Well, no, they had spoken to me. It's part of the calls to action.
Yeah.
We didn't necessarily pick the day, but we did say that there should be a national day when we can all gather together to stand for reconciliation. I've always believed that we don't take a moment for those who have experienced this, the survivors of residential schools and those who were lost through residential schools, and that it's important that we do that we take that moment for them to understand what this country did to them, and to acknowledge that it was wrong and to commit to not doing it again, just like they do for veterans who've come out of the war. That it's not just about marching and dressing up and getting some time off from school and closing stores and getting some time off from work, but it's about remembering what they have done. And if you fully understand what that Veterans Day ceremony is all about, you won't be able to prevent yourself from crying, because then you'll remember that some of these men and women who died for us died horrible, terrible deaths, all in the name of defending us, defending what we had. And in the same way, as we're standing there thinking about those survivors from residential school, it will be important for us to remember that they may not have realized what was being done to them or the magnitude of it, but they did share in a common experience that was not of their making, and that we are atoning for that through this day, but we are also committing that we will never do this again.
I have mixed feelings about the day. I don't know that a day set aside for residential school survivors and those who didn't is enough. What does it really accomplish? Will people take that moment, that day, and honor those lives that were taken? Will they remember or hold sacred the survivors that made it through? Do you really think that it'll accomplish that?
Most people in this country won't. But next year there will be one more there. And the year after that there will be one more. The more effort we put into it, the more we will persuade to understand this. Because you must always remember that the most important thing that the work of the TRC accomplished is not to uncover what happened, but to make it part of our national memory. And that's a difficult thing to achieve, but it's an important thing to achieve. And this story of what happened to Indigenous people over these many generations must never be allowed to be forgotten. And that's why legislating it, I think, was important, because it forces you to acknowledge that this day something happened. And our young children will be asking, why are we doing this on this day? And then you will have an opportunity at that point in time to create another person who understands.
One mind at a time, right?
One mind at a time.
You're so smart, Mur. Thank you so much for teaching me this. And of course, this day comes on a especially difficult time for Indigenous people and for this entire country, with the ongoing recovery of our children from residential school grounds continuing to take place across the country. What do you think should happen? What kind of investigation into these recoveries should the federal government be leading?
Well, I think the most important thing is that to look at establishing ways by which the people who are responsible for the deaths of children in the schools can and should be held accountable if accountability is an issue. Some children would have died naturally, of course, but the fact that they died in places that were distant from their families in and of itself is a tragedy. And we need to understand that part of the process of inquiry and investigation needs to be about finding out how they died and why they died, and to the extent that there may be an individual or a group that's responsible for that, or an entity, such as those who are managing the schools have responsibility for it, then they need to be named, and they need to be held accountable for that in some way. It may be difficult, and I know that there's a debate going on out there that people should be prosecuted. That may be difficult because then you have to get into the issue of finding the victimizer and finding a process by which they can be prosecuted, and then determining what to do with them if they are in fact convicted, or face the possibility that they may not be convicted because the evidence may not be able to establish culpability beyond a reasonable doubt. So I'm not one to advocate prosecutions, but I am one who advocates for there to be an accountability process. And we have to do it before we forget about it, so that we don't allow ourselves to be subjected to disinformation campaigns by entities who will persuade you that they did the best they could and it's not their fault. It's somebody else's fault. And we can't allow that to occur, because then we will grow up with a distorted view of history. So the one thing we can learn from Germany, for example, is how they responded to the Holocaust and the stories around the Holocaust and how they responded to it as a government, but also as a society, and what they said about it. And, it's still an offense in Germany to deny the Holocaust. And it should be an offense in Canada to deny the existence of this story. And yet, we're not even talking about that. And we're not also talking about what we need to do about the fact that, by my estimation, probably just in those schools that are listed in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, there's only 138 of them, probably at least 25,000 people died. And I said, what other school system has that many deaths? None. Not in the whole world, no place has had that many deaths. But the other thing that people need to keep in mind is that those 138 schools were not the only schools to which children were sent and where they died. Yeah. There were, by the estimates of the TRC report, probably an additional 1,000 schools that were used as residential schools where Indigenous children were sent. They were run by provincial governments or by charitable organizations or by church entities, but the government didn't have a management team in place dealing with them. 150,000 kids went to 138 schools in the Residential School Settlement Agreement. If there's an additional 1,000 schools, then there's probably an additional 1 million kids that went to those schools. And if we figure that 10 to 15% of the kids who went to residential schools died, then you do the math. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of kids dying in residential schools.
And it's horrific. It's horrific. I feel so emotional about it every time.
Yeah.
Every time, I'm just like, I'm going to cry right now. Mm-hmm. And I'm so angry, Murray. I'm so angry.
I understand.
How do we get through this when we know it's going to just get darker and darker and darker and darker?
Well, imagine if you were there. Yeah. Imagine if you were one of those who lost a friend and saw your friend die. It's difficult. It's difficult to imagine.
Yeah. I think about my mother, who was a residential school survivor.
Yeah.
And what she might have went through. We see it written on her body and see it how in her behavior and how she's led her life. And, I just don't know what to tell her, about these discoveries. I remember going into her room when they first found those 215 children in Kamloops and telling her, Mom, they found bodies. And she said, I know. I've been telling people this. We've been telling people this.
Yep.
For forever.
Yep.
Years and years. And some people have said that this news apparently of these mass graves has woken them up and to the reality of the residential school experience and the intergenerational impacts and all of the things. Do you see that? Do you see an awakening happening in non-Indigenous Canada?
I see an overcoming of disbelief. I don't know if that's an awakening or not, but I see an overcoming of disbelief because a real grave is real evidence, and people now cannot deny the evidence. They can say, that the person who was testifying was exaggerating, or that they're not remembering correctly, or they're misnaming people, or it was not there, it was someplace else, and it wasn't really a residential school. So, they can kind of pass it off as a mistake on the part of the survivors. And many try to, and you'll still see it today. But the discovery of real bodies in real graves in the earth at a real school site is undeniable. I knew that we were going to have this kind of a process of discovery continue after the TRC ended. And I warned people that we're not done yet. We're done as commissioners, but the process of uncovering the truth of this is not yet finished. But in this time that we have had to do this, we have opened the eyes of this country. And now we have not only opened people's eyes, but we have turned people's heads. The ones who would look away now can no longer look away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And those people that have overcome their disbelief and now want to do something about reconciliation, to bring this truth out, this Gichitapwewin, this big truth. What do you say to them, those in the Catholic Church in particular, or any church that ran those schools, who are trying to reconcile this desire to seek reconciliation with a leader, a pope, who will not apologize for the church's role?
What I have said is that you have lost your legitimacy as a church. Mm-hmm. You have lost your legitimacy as a spiritual entity, and therefore you need to understand that. They deny that, of course. The leaders of the church deny that. They will talk about how they're still catering to the needs of their congregations, and that there will always be a need for their churches, and I give them that. But I said people will realize that at a certain point that you may not be the entity that they should be showering with their absolute belief and faith, and they may go elsewhere. And I said to young people growing up, if they're being educated in a school about a certain thing and about a certain way in which the church has behaved in the schools and the results that were done, I said, do you really think they're going to raise their children to be Catholic? I don't think so. They're going to question you more than I did when I was a student. I said, my grandmother wanted me to be a priest. She raised me to be a priest, and I was ready to be a priest until I started reading about the church and what it did during the Second World War in particular. And I said, I can't be an advocate for an organization that did that to Jewish people. And I said, young people will turn away from the church in more numbers and in larger numbers than they ever have in the past because of this. And they know it. And in addition to that, of course, the church is being sued, the Catholic Church in particular is being sued around the world for the abuses that they've inflicted upon their congregations or members of their congregations. So they've lost their credibility.
Yeah, certainly. Have you spoken with the Pope?
No.
Would you speak with the Pope?
If he asked me to.
You just bust in the Vatican and be like, yo, sup, Pope? Pull up a chair. I got some schooling to do.
I've always said to people that we must not behave like they behave.
Well, fine. Now, the TRC lasted, of course, 5 years. When you look back and remember all the places you visited and heard all of the stories, what do you carry with you from that time now?
The love of the survivors. They helped me get through it. You know, I'm a pretty strong guy spiritually and emotionally, but sitting every day and listening to stories of survivors, again, you know, you can have an 88-year-old guy sitting in front of you, and he's crying his eyes out because of what happened to him at residential school, and you can't help but think of him as a little boy. You know, just a little, 3, 4, 5-year-old boy, and this was being done to him, and so we would have to take breaks and allow ourselves a moment to gather our thoughts and our emotions. But at the end of the day, the survivors would all gather in a circle because we would accommodate their needs in that way. We would give them a circle, and they would want us to join with them. And they would thank us, and they would share with us how the experience was. But to a person, I think they all said, we need you to finish this. We need you to be strong. So don't let this wear you down. We need you to be strong. And it was their love that carried me through. And, my kids will tell you about the grannies. We had a group of grannies. I think there were 8 of them who came to every single national event from all over the country. They were mainly from Alberta, Saskatchewan,
Wow.
and BC. And they always sat in the front row of the events that we held, where I was either listening to survivors speak or else I was speaking. And then they would always hug me.
Oh, that's so beautiful.
Yeah. And the TRC said they would be accommodated, and if we found out that one of the grannies couldn't afford to come or something, then we would arrange to transport her, because we had done fundraising to ensure that we had money for survivors to travel. So we would make sure the granny groupies could travel with us.
That's so beautiful, the granny group. I love it. I love it. All right, time to put your DJ hat on. Is there a song that you like to listen to when you've had a tough day, maybe, and the load is a little too heavy, and you're looking for some strength in the tunes?
Well, The Who. I really like The Who song, particularly the Wolf Totem, because it's about standing up and pushing back against those who are attacking you, whether spiritually or physically. And it's in a language that I don't have any understanding of. It's Mongolian, and I'm sure there's a tribal connection there that I'm totally missing. But it's amazing. It's actually quite amazing. It really touches me spiritually, and it makes my spirit stand up. And I can't swear on the radio, can I?
We'll beep you out. We'll beep it.
Makes my spirit want to stand up and say, "F you." Okay.
Murray Sinclair just swore on my show, you guys. Love it. You're listening to Unreserved. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Murray Sinclair is my guest. We're talking about the first ever National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Murray, there'll be people listening to our conversation who want to make, the day meaningful, September 30th, but really don't know where to begin or how to begin. What would you say to them? What would you suggest they do today, on that day?
I always tell people the first thing they need to do is learn, is to make a commitment to learn. If they haven't read the TRC report, then they should find a part of it to read. And that includes the summary. I think the summary itself is a good summary. Clara Hughes' mother made that commitment when she found out that Clara was an honorary witness to the TRC. And her mother called all of her friends that she would have together for teas in the afternoon, and she would call them all together and bring them into her house. And then she would hold up the TRC summary report, and she would say, "We're going to read this together." And they would read a chapter of it or part of it, and then they would talk about it every week. And then they would make a commitment to call somebody. They'd call a city politician or a provincial politician, or they would write letters to people, or they would tell their church congregations, or they would tell their friends and neighbors. But they made a commitment to do something with the knowledge that they were gaining. And they also encouraged their children and their grandchildren to come and listen to them read the report out loud.
Wow.
And Clara brought her mother to an event that I was speaking at, and Clara said, "I want my mother to tell you this story." And so her mother was a beautiful elderly woman. Clara's big and muscular, as you would expect an Olympic athlete to be, but her mother was very petite and very quiet. But she said, "We had our event last week, and one of the grandmothers brought her granddaughter who's pregnant and going to have a baby. And we had a recording of your speech, and we played it for everybody to listen to," she said. "And after it was over, then we talked about what you said in your speech. And when it was her turn to talk, we asked her what she thought. And she said she was starting to cry because she had listened to the speech. And she said, "I love Justice Sinclair. I think he's the most wonderful human being. I'm going to name my baby after him." And so she said she just had her baby. And she did name her baby after you. And she named her baby Justice. It's a true story.
That's amazing. Now, you mentioned your Ojibwe name earlier, Mazana Gizik,
Yeah.
which, as you said, means the one who speaks of pictures in the sky. I'm hoping you can paint us a picture right now. What would this land look like and feel like if true reconciliation?
I can't say honestly that I know. I can tell you what I'd like it to look like. I'm often inspired by reading provisions of the Royal Proclamation of 1763.
A little light reading there for you?
Yeah, not the part about where the Crown proclaims that it is, from this point forward, the holder of title to all the land. But the part where they say that we commit ourselves hereby to recognize the rights of Indigenous people in their own territories, and that they are entitled to maintain their own territories until they agree in proper ceremony to surrender their territory to the Crown. And until that day, they will always be allowed to continue their lives uninterrupted. And I think that's the question that I often challenge Indigenous people to think about, and that is, if we had been allowed to continue our lives uninterrupted, what would we be doing? How would we be functioning? What would our chiefs be empowered to do? What would our elders be empowered to do? How would our grandmothers and grandfathers be treated? Where would they be sitting in the councils? Mm-hmm. And I think that most Indigenous people don't know the answer to that because they haven't yet figured out who they are and who their people are and what their teachings are. And so I think that process needs to be gone through. But I would say that I've seen inklings of how Indigenous governance can work if we allow it to work, and Indigenous people to function if we could function in accordance with our own belief systems and without outside interference. And I would say that's what it is that we need to strive for as part of the process of reconciliation. The Government of Canada does what it needs to do, and the Indigenous governance entities will do what they need to do within their own territories, and neither will interfere with the other, and there will be a common means upon which they agree to resolve any disputes between them. And at this point in time, we're not anywhere near there yet, but we can get there if we recognize the importance of getting there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair, thank you so much for your time today, your stories, your wisdom, you even changed my mind a little. One mind at a time,
well,
right?
I'm just glad you found it.
I was shocked too. I was like, what? Cool. Thank you so much. That was the Honorable Justice Mr. Murray Sinclair, retired senator and former lead of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But you can call him Mur. This episode of Unreserved was produced by Kim Kasher and Aaron Knoll. I'm your favorite cousin, Rosanna Deerchild, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Thanks for listening. Ginaskanamit now. Agosay.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.